While history is generally seen as viewing the past to learn for the present and potential future, one example that explains this most thoroughly is probably Adolf Hitler and the rise of Germany. Now, first, after World War I, Germany turned into a republic. Uh, they would call it the Weimar Republic. This is going to be established after World War I. They did have a king, a monarchy system with a Congress, but that is going to completely end. They're going to get rid of the king, and that was one of the agreements for the peace of World War I. Now, Germany is having to deal with a new form of government that they haven't really practiced before, and they're going to have to do this at a pretty rapid pace. So, as far as other nations are concerned, like the United States and Britain, they have had a practiced government for hundreds of years, where you would have a president of the United States and then a Congress working together, or you would have a shared monarchy with the parliament in Britain. Now, Germany is going to have to learn this entire process all on its own. And the problem with this is they don't have really any political leadership prior to this point. They look to the king for that political leadership. That's not going to happen. What Germany did try to do is they did a lot of experimental legislative procedures, and they changed quite frequently. Also, in Germany and much of Europe, in that case, they're going to have multiple parties or multiple groups competing for control and their legislation. So, a lot of compromises are going to be very apparent and very frequent. That is not the case in the United States, just to give you a little bit of comparison. So there's a lot of inactivity due to these political groups trying to make gains. And what happened was not a whole lot happened. Now Germany is certainly in a bad financial condition and situation. Certainly after the war, 1921 they make their first payment. 1922 they're unable due to their financial situation being so dire. And then you have the French taking over probably the most profitable portion of their financial structure, the rural mines and their factories. So now they cannot produce much more money. What happens is inflation, and essentially paper money is going to be used as insulation, toilet paper, and those sorts of things. It's pretty much regarded as useless. And so Germany at this point generally, unofficially, goes to a barter system, to where you're trading certain items or tools, anything you really have, for bread or some sort of food. And this is the condition where we have Adolf Hitler coming to power. What Germany observed, and certainly Adolf Hitler observed, was that change wasn't coming, and it wasn't coming quickly in the governmental system. It wasn't working. And certainly by the 20s, you had the onset of depression. And then certainly we know of the 1930s, or at least 1928, 29, you're going to have a depression. That's going to hit Germany even harder than the rest of these countries that are in Europe as well as the United States. So what happened was many different groups were more willing to try drastic measures. What you're going to see around the world is communist parties, for example, are going to crop up in places you typically wouldn't find it. For example, the United States, there's going to be a communist party that is growing in power in the 1920s. Certainly as the Great Depression starts its growth, and a lot of people are out of work, they see that maybe democracy isn't working and maybe it's not the form of government that should be in place. And so the communist movement certainly rises to power in the mid and late 1920s. The other group that is going to be rising to power is the fascist movement. Now, the fascist movement is more of a conservative wing, but the fascist movement is looking towards a militarized state, kind of going back to the governments of ancient times were the entire state, and everybody is a tool for the state for the betterment of the state. In this case, it's a militarized state. Where the factories are supporting the military, the people are supporting the military by working in the factories, farming the fields, and joining the army. So Adolf Hitler, after World War One, he was decorated in World War One, but it had a profound impact on himself, but also much of the generation of Germans that survived World War One. So what happened in World War One? They saw a great amount of violence and brutality, and most people coming out of World War One were more prone to violence to get things done and get things changed than, for example, in previous generations and even generations afterwards. And this isn't just happening in Germany. There's also movements in Russia and all over Europe and the United States that are more prone for violent acts, upheavals to get things done. This is no different with Adolf Hitler and the Germans. In the 1920s, 1924, Adolf Hitler will have joined the Nazi movement. And the Nazi movement was a group of former veterans of World War One. They had joined a political party, and they were trying to gain seats in the Congress in Germany. The Reichstag is what they called it. So, one of the reasons why he joined the Nazi movement was he felt a belonging in the army during World War One. He had failed his examination in the Art Institute in Vienna, and so that was one of the reasons why he joined the army. After joining the army, he felt brotherhood, a sense of belonging, but then after World War One, they had to reduce that amount to about 100,000 troops in Germany. So much of the lower rankings of the military, privates, for example, corporals, are going to be removed. What they are going to do is they are going to keep, essentially, the officers. So you have 100,000 officers in the military. So he's looking for a sense of belonging, as well as many other Germans. So some Germans are going to join the communist movement, and some Germans are going to join the fascist movement, and some certainly the republic that is in place in Germany at this time. That's some of the encouraging factors of why Hitler involves himself in the Nazi Party. Now he found that he rose through the ranks rather rapidly, in part due to his very eloquent way of speaking at these rallies. And so he went from political rally to political rally, speaking for the Nazi movement, gaining power, gaining more responsibility. And so in 1924, he tries to overthrow the Weimar Republic through a coup. He thought he had the aid of the army and the police. He did not, and so he was arrested. He's going to be jailed for 1 year, and this is for treason. He is trying to overthrow the government of Germany. During his time in prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, which is basically a roadmap in how he believes Germany should be remade. We'll come back to this in a second. But after 1 year, he had a hearing to see whether or not he should remain in prison if he had been, for example, rehabilitated. A lawyer argued that he should remain in prison. He was a traitor, and 1 year was not long enough, and he should not be let out. However, the judge ruled that he had been rehabilitated and he was let out. You would typically never find a treason case where somebody would remain in prison 1 year and let out. In this case, that is something that happens. After his jail term, he is going to rejoin the Nazi movement, but instead they come to the conclusion that they need to partake in this democratic process and try to shift the movement of the government from the inside. So this is where they start going from town to town, location to location, speaking for their party and trying to get Nazi members in the Reichstag. What you're seeing is a very similar political movement to what we see in democracies, especially in the United States. You have a bunch of legislators and political figures trying to get in office, looking for votes. And so this is what the Germans are going to look at, and they are going to try to replicate this. What they did was they ran on a platform that was formed by Adolf Hitler throughout his book of Mein Kampf. What he stated was they needed to deny the Treaty of Versailles, basically don't obey it. It weakened Germany. It was a humiliation for Germany. What they also advocated for was a strengthening of the economy, and then to also provide jobs. Strengthening the economy and providing jobs is a time-old tactic. It works. It's worked all over the world in many democracies, and Adolf Hitler is going to use this as well. So in this process, he is going to start also blaming the Jews. And this is going to rally a lot of Germans as well. What he's blaming the Jews for is profiting off of the war and potentially convincing the leaders during World War I to surrender. In World War I, Germany did not have a last battle where their armies were defeated. Instead, what the German leaders, military commanders, as well as political leaders, saw was that the Americans were bringing more and more troops. The assault that they had at the beginning of 1918 did not work, and they knew they could not replace all the troops, and American troops were coming in more and more. They knew they were just going to lose based on the weight of more and more troops coming down, so they didn't see the point of fighting on. So they made a peace agreement. One of those was getting rid of the Kaiser. So there was not this ultimate defeat, last battle that capitulated the German army. And so many Germans are going to hold on to that sentiment and blame that it wasn't the German military, the German army, or the German people that ended this war. It was actually an outside group, and they thought that the political leaders, and in this case the Jews, also ended this war unarmedly for the Germans. And so they are going to be used as a scapegoat, and this is going to be very popular. There's a lot of bad stuff going on in Germany at this time. The economy is bad. Their territory is not as big as it was at the beginning of World War I. And so the Jews become a scapegoat of sorts. What happened, of course, in 1928, 29, and on, is you have the Great Depression. And that is just going to move more people to be more drastic and move towards thinking that maybe the fascist or communist movements are going to get things done. And certainly with Hitler's message and the Nazi Party's message is that they're going to rebuild Germany, they're going to build an army, they are going to expand, they're going to get more land, they're going to get more jobs to the people, and straighten out the financial situation of Germany and bring Germany back to what it was prior to World War I. It was a very enticing message, and a lot of people voted in kind for Nazi Party leaders. And so as a result, more and more Nazi political individuals would make it into the Reichstag. What Hitler, as well as the Nazi Party, is also going to do is they are going to hire individuals to partake in the SA. What the SA were a group of veterans, as well as other young individuals. They would partake in the Nazi movements. They were the ones dressed in brown shirts, and they would have the red armband with the swastika on that armband. What they would do is they'd go around and they would encourage people to vote for the Nazi Party or whoever Nazi Party individual was in that district. If you refused, then they would beat you up, break your legs. If you were a communist, for example, they would beat you up, break your legs. The key part about that is you would be so injured you wouldn't be able to make it to the polling place. And so through intimidation, as well as actually crippling people, more and more people started voting for Nazis, or they were unable to make it to the polling stations. And so, through this intimidation, more and more people started to vote, or not even vote at all. And so, in the threat of violence, there was silence from the other side. And so, the Nazi Party, as well as Hitler, started getting more state positions. They also had informants in law enforcement, as well as the army. Now, as far as Adolf Hitler becoming the Chancellor of Germany, Reichstag was burned to the ground in 1933. Now, Adolf Hitler is going to blame the communist movement. The communist movement was very popular. It did have growing numbers, and so Hitler viewed it as the party that was the greatest threat to the Nazi movement. And so he convinced the High Chancellor to name the communists as a national enemy, and Hitler said he would take care of the problem. And so he unleashed the SA on them, beating them up, putting them in prison, of course, at times killing them as well. And he was given a brief title, a 6-month position to take care of the problem. He was proclaimed a dictator, but in 1933, through the Enabling Act, there was a vote on whether or not Hitler could have this dictatorship for life, and since a majority of the legislation was the Nazi Party, they of course passed it, and as a result, Hitler is going to be a part of being the High Chancellor, but also the dictator for Germany from this point onward. So, now that Hitler is in power, now he can start moving towards denying the Treaty of Versailles, but also growing Germany and basically expanding and capitalizing on his book Mein Kampf. And so in 1935, he forms the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, and the Wehrmacht, which is the German Army. And they increase the size of these troops to 550,000. Part of the reason why they're able to increase the sizes of these forces so high is because basically prior to this point, 1933, and certainly arguably even before that, what they were doing was that they were training individuals to go into the army. They could only have 100,000, so they would have a group or a portion of that 100,000 go into reserves or retire. And so they would have this cycling fashion where you'd have, for example, let's say 50,000 troops retire. They would include another 50,000 they would serve for a year or two, and then they would just keep recycling these. But also these units, the SA, were trained in military tactics as well as the way of what an army would be. And so when they formed the Army and the Air Force, all these SAs would get a job in the Army or the Air Force or any other branch of the military arm. Now, of course, 550,000 is much, much higher than 100,000. This is going to be condemned by Europe as well as the League of Nations. But they're not going to do anything about it. The reason being is they're in the throes of the Depression. They are not powerful enough to really go to war, and nobody really wants to go to war at this time anyway. It's very shortly after World War I. Nobody is ready for another war. They just experienced the horrific experience of World War I, so nobody is willing to actually stop Germany and put a halt to it. Germany is also, at this point, going to create a navy. They're going to start building surface vessels as well as submarines. Now in March of 1936, Germany is going to occupy the Rhineland, expanding its territory, and they're going to argue that this is to expand for living space for Germans. They're claiming there are too many Germans and not enough land for them to be housed. And so as a result, that's their reasoning. France, Britain, and the rest of Europe does nothing. So that encourages him, as well as what was going on in the United States of being an isolationist country, basically stating they're not going to get involved in any European affairs, so he knows he only has to deal with potentially England and France. So at this point in 1937, he is going to go into Austria and also Czechoslovakia, citing the same stance that the Germans need living space. So on September 28th, 1938, we have the Munich Conference, where Hitler, as well as the prime ministers of Britain and France, meet. They are going to discuss essentially what's going on. Of course, Britain and France are saying, Hitler, as well as Germany, you cannot go in these regions. This is an invasion. This is a violation of sovereignty. The one group that was not invited to these talks was, of course, Czechoslovakians. Their fate was being decided by these outside powers, Germany, France, and Britain. So as a result, that, of course, was not sitting well with the Czechs. But Hitler stated that he would not invade any further. This was all the land he was going to grab. He would not take any more land or violate any more treaties. And so with this agreement, Britain and France went back home. Hitler would be able to keep Czechoslovakia and Austria, and Britain and France went back. The British Prime Minister Clemenceau, he would state that he had secured peace in our time. Of course, we know that is going to be false. After this, Germany is going to make a peace treaty with Joseph Stalin. Basically, this peace treaty is a non-aggression act. This is going to secure basically the border with the East, Germany and Russia, or the Soviet Union as it's called at that time. Essentially, what they agreed to is that they will not attack each other or have any sort of warfare with one another for 2 years. So this is an agreement to basically, in this agreement, they decided to split Poland. This, of course, was not public knowledge, but basically it was an agreement that Soviets would get one portion of Poland, the eastern portion, and Germany would get the western portion of Poland, and that would be the extent of their border. And they would not conduct any sort of offensive action against one another. So what this signaled was one part, that Germany and the Soviets were going to be allied. They would not go to war against one another, but that left the rest of Europe for Hitler to conquer at his leisure. And so on September 1st, 1939, Hitler is going to invade Poland and get his portion, and 2 weeks later, Russia is going to invade the eastern portion of Poland, and Poland just doesn't stand a chance whatsoever. The Polish army is caught completely unaware. Their forces are obsolete. They don't have the numbers to take on Germany, and then, as of course, the Soviet Union. Their planes are completely obsolete, and this is going to be the first instance of blitzkrieg warfare. Now, what blitzkrieg warfare is lightning warfare is what it's called. That's generally what it translates into. You're going to use the army and the Air Force to attack in one fluid movement with all of these forces working together. So you're going to have tanks in the center, and you're going to have infantry on the sides. The tanks are going to clear the way forward. The infantry will follow through, secure these territories, and the Air Force will communicate with radios with the Army, and the Air Force is going to bomb any tanks or forts, artillery positions, anything that might be able to hinder the Army. And so as a result, this lightning warfare is very, very rapid, very quick, and it catches everyone by surprise. One of the main problems is the Germans have radios. Everyone else doesn't, for the most part. But that gets more into World War II, and we'll discuss that at a later point. But On September 1st, 1939, is the invasion of Poland. This is the point where France and Britain declare war on Germany, and they start raising their forces. Wartime production starts, rationing starts, and so that starts World War II. So one of the lessons of the rise of Hitler is certainly we have the situation where you have some drastic means being taken. You can certainly see how an individual can use democracy for their own gains, and certainly in desperate situations, people vote certain ways and people allow certain freedoms to be sacrificed in an idea that there is a greater threat out there. In this case, it was blamed on Jews as well as the communists, that they are threatening the country and it needs to be saved. And so Hitler and the Nazi Party very smartly decided that they could use democracy for their own uses, and they usurped it from the inside. So that certainly is one lesson to be learned from this entire ordeal. And of course, World War II and the next several years, certainly the next 5 years, will be rather horrific for Europe, and eventually the Americans will get involved, and it's quite some fascinating but also horrific history going on in the next portion. So quickly just wanted to go over how Hitler came to power. Certainly some lessons can be taken from that. And certainly a lot of people take away from this that freedom should never be denied, and to fight any sort of thwarting of freedoms in whatever means it may be, with any inch. So take that to heart, and that'll be it for this.